Hello, everyone. My name is David, and I'm glad you guys are tuning in today. Let me just quickly introduce myself. I graduated from UCSD as a philosophy major. I'm also one of the staff members here, part of Grace Point San Diego Church. And I'm just glad to be here to give this presentation on the resurrection of Jesus. So today we're going to be addressing this question. Is it plausible that Jesus rose from the dead? I don't know about you, but I think this is a really crazy question. Do you really believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Just think about it. When's the last time you've seen a guy come back to life? Now, before anyone loses their faith, I think you'll be surprised that there is actually good historical evidence that this isn't as crazy as it sounds. Now, before I go into this question, let me explain a little bit about how this question became real for me. Growing up, I actually grew up in church my whole life. And so when I came to college at UCSD my freshman year, I remember hanging out a lot with a lot of my suite mates in the lounge on the 4th floor of Tioga Hall in Muir College. One moment that sticks out for me is when one of my suite mates started asking me about my faith that night. And one of those guys asked me, "Do you really believe in Christianity?" And I was adamant that I did. But the follow-up question was, "How do you know?" And the truth is, I didn't know. I just kind of assumed everything all my life until that point. And that actually bothered me. So my freshman year, I really wanted to know if Christianity matched up with the world around me. Because if it didn't, why be a Christian at all if it isn't true? So long story short, I actually went through a course called Course 101, and I found intellectually compelling answers to a lot of my doubts, especially on this topic of the resurrection. So my hope for tonight's talk over stream can be for you that you can have that intellectually compelling moment for you. That you may really, really want to know for yourself if it's even possible that Jesus rose from the dead. So, before we tackle this main question, I think it's worth actually going into briefly to another question. Why is the resurrection of Jesus so important? I mean, why should we be concerned about this resurrection? Well, I think one answer might be curiosity about the resurrection. You might be curious about what Christians have to say and about how a man who claimed to be God comes back from the grave. But, I would actually propose that the curiosity is only scratching the surface. For Christians, the resurrection is more than knowledge. In the New Testament, you actually see the first century apostle of Jesus Paul, put it this way. He says, quote, "If Christ had not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. Then those who have also fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied." You see, for Christians, the resurrection means everything. The basis for the whole Christian faith rests on this, that Jesus rose from the grave after his death. If anyone can show that the resurrection didn't happen, the Christian faith is, in Paul's words, futile. And it's just kind of one big lie. One can simply just kind of eliminate it and go on with our lives. However, I think you'll see soon that Christians have solid historical evidence for believing that Christ has been raised. One last point for why the resurrection is a big deal is that it validates who Jesus is and what he said. One of the interesting things is that Jesus claimed to be God in the flesh. The resurrection is a validation on that claim because if there is no resurrection of Jesus, then he simply died and he's still dead. But if there is a resurrection, then he not only claimed to be God, but backed it up by dying and rising. So the resurrection is very important in accepting Jesus not just as a man, but God in human flesh. For this presentation, I'm going to be taking the most skeptical data out there and trying to make a case from a very skeptical position. You see, there are many details that can be said about the trial, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and some people accept all of those details as facts. and some people are kind of in between, and then others will accept a very few minute set of details as facts. And I want to use the facts of a vast number of scholars accept as true. So just to give you an idea of that, there's about, let's say, 100 items on the trial, death, and resurrection of Jesus, give or take. People who believe the Bible has no errors would take all of those items as facts, right? Now, others believe that the Bible is divinely inspired, but has some minor errors that will maybe give you about 95 of those facts, of the 100. Others who believe that the Bible is divinely inspired, but they believe the Bible is mostly a historical work, will probably give you about 70 of those facts of the 100. Now, skeptical scholars will probably give you about 20. And then of those 20, a very small group of skeptical scholars will probably grant you about 12 facts on the resurrection of Jesus. What I want to tell you is that tonight, I don't think you need all 12. In fact, tonight, I'm just going to limit myself to only 4 of those facts. More skeptical than the most skeptical scholars out there, and where a vast majority of scholars in the world on this subject would agree upon. So with this in mind, let's look at the 4 facts surrounding Jesus' death and resurrection. We're going to call it the 4 E's of the resurrection. The first E is for execution. Before you can have a resurrection, you had to have a death. What you find about this fact is that there is no dispute out there in the field that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate. 5 outside sources of ancient history back up this fact on various classical works that talk about Jesus. You have Josephus, Tacitus, Marabar Serapion, Lucian, and the Jewish Talmud. They all write that Jesus was crucified and died. And even the most skeptical scholars on this subject who do not believe the resurrection actually have this to say. This is Bart Ehrman. He's the American New Testament scholar at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he's a resurrection skeptic. And he would tell you, he says, quote, "The crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans is one of the most secure facts we have about his life." Gerd Ludemann, also a German atheist New Testament scholar and resurrection skeptic, he has this to say, quote, "Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable." One would be actually laughed at any reputable institution or university if one would deny the fact that Jesus was executed on a Roman cross. So fact 1, Jesus was executed. Now the second E is for early, as in early accounts. We have early accounts or early reports that Jesus rose from the dead. Now why is that important? Well, one can easily accept the fact that Jesus died since it's so well attested to. But the idea that Jesus rose from the dead could just be a legend that just got added on later like a game of telephone. Like this picture shows here, one person tells something like peas to the next person and then to the next, and before you know it, we end up with fleas. Something was added or changed that was not there from before. A. N. Shuren White, he's a historian of ancient Rome at Oxford University, says that the process by which historical events are corrupted and replaced with legend happens over centuries and not over decades. So the question becomes, do we have any early sources that can show us that just the idea of Jesus rising from the dead existed before legend could accumulate? Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul actually gives us a tradition known as an early creed of what Christians believed on as facts early on. And this is what he has to say. He says, "For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. Now, this portion is said to have been written approximately 25 years after Jesus' death. Gerd Ludemann, again the atheist New Testament scholar, he dates this oral creed tradition existing to at very most 2 to 3 years after Jesus' death. This is really impressive. Consider these 2 biographies of Alexander the Great. This is by Arrian and Plutarch. They were written about 400 years after the life of Alexander the Great, and they're generally considered reliable. But here, we have at most 25 years, at most, for legend to accumulate, which is insane, as we noted earlier that it takes centuries for legend to accumulate. So there's not enough of a time gap for this to happen. And this and other early accounts found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the book of Acts, the Pauline epistles, they were all circulating around in the first century. This is during the time of Jesus' contemporaries, and so they would have been all too happy to point out the errors if the early Christians in the first century were just making this stuff up. At the very least, we can say that as a fact, that people believed that the resurrection from the very beginning. So we have execution, and we have early reports of the resurrection. As the third fact that starts with the E is that we have an empty tomb. Now, there's so much that can be said for why a wide range of scholars accept this fact, but what we are not saying is why there's an empty tomb, but just establishing that there was one. So for the sake of time, here are a few reasons that are convincing to me for why we can know as a fact that there was an empty tomb. The first one is the Jerusalem factor, as explained by philosophy professor William Lane Craig. He says, quote, "One of the most remarkable facts about the early Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection was that it flourished in the very city where Jesus had been publicly crucified." He continues on, "So long as the people of Jerusalem thought that Jesus' body was in the tomb, few would have been prepared to believe such nonsense as that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Even if they had so believed, the Jewish authorities would have exposed the whole affair simply by pointing to Jesus' tomb, or perhaps even exhuming the body as decisive proof that Jesus had not been raised." End quote. Since the site of Jesus' tomb was known to Christians and non-Christians in Jerusalem, it would have been quite impossible for a religion to explode at the very place where a lie on the empty tomb could have been verified. Then there's the criteria of embarrassment. According to the Gospels, the women were the first to see the empty tomb. Why is this important? Well, back then, women were not considered reliable witnesses or even credible. The Jewish Talmud actually says, quote, "Any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer." Now, if anyone were to be making this stuff up in first century Palestine, why would you want to say women saw it happen? If one were wanting to fabricate an empty tomb and a risen Jesus in the first century Mediterranean culture, you wouldn't want to cite women as your eyewitnesses, unless that's actually what happened. And finally, I think one of the more convincing, and I think this is kind of the last point that is the strongest for me, is the enemy attestation. This is the most conclusive, I think, because even the very responses from the enemies of Jesus solidifies the fact that there was an empty tomb. Now, why? What was the response of the enemies of Jesus when the disciples stated that they were saying that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, we have sources inside and outside the New Testament that they were saying things like, the disciples stole the body. In other words, they had a cover story implicitly admitting that the tomb was empty. It's like a teacher asking the student, "Where's your homework, Billy?" And Billy responds, "My dog ate it." What is he implicitly admitting? That he doesn't have his homework. Same works for the enemies of Jesus. They attest to the fact that the tomb is empty in their very own response, that the disciples stole the body. So Jesus was executed. There were early accounts of the resurrection. There's an empty tomb. And now we've come to the final E, and that's the eyewitnesses of Jesus. Now, Jesus appears alive in a dozen different instances, to 515 eyewitnesses, to skeptics, to doubters, believers, men, women, groups. He talked, touched, and ate with them. And so, unfortunately, we don't have much that was recorded by these witnesses. Much of what was written in the first century is lost. But this is what we do have, and I think it's very powerful and it's persuasive. Normally, we're lucky if we have, one or two sources from ancient history to confirm a fact. But here we have 9. And the fact that many of these eyewitnesses were convinced or convicted that and persuaded about the risen Jesus is extraordinary. Dr. Michael Licona, who has dedicated his life on the historical Jesus, he goes over these 9 primary sources in his book, The Resurrection of Jesus. Now, the first primary source that he uses is the creed that we talked about earlier. This passes the test of historicity so well that even one of the few Jewish scholars, Pinchas Lapid, says that it may be considered as a statement of eyewitnesses. It confirms the conviction, at the very least, that the early Christians had seen Jesus. Then there's Paul's testimony about the disciples in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 11, where he's saying that he encountered Jesus and that he met up with the apostles to confirm that they had the same message. Paul confirms their belief about seeing the risen Jesus. Then there's the book of Acts. Most scholars will accept at the very least that the book of Acts is a summary of the preaching of the early Christians, proclaiming that Jesus rose from the dead. Again, confirming that the preaching was that they saw the risen Jesus. Finally, we have the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I believe at a minimum they report with reliability the essentials of the death and resurrection of Jesus. More and more scholars have come to the point of respecting the Gospel writings as historical sources. In them, they contain 9 different appearances of people meeting the resurrected Jesus. Now, outside of the New Testament, we also have documents where we have writings of people under the apostles. People like Clement, who was ordained by Peter, and he wrote about how the disciples had a complete certainty of the risen Jesus. He's confirming that the apostles believed that they were eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus. We have the writings of Polycarp, who was an appointed bishop by the apostle John. He also gives an account of the disciples seeing the risen Jesus. So here we have 9 ancient primary sources inside and outside of the New Testament confirming the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus. This is so much historical data that we have to go to what the atheist scholar Gerd Ludemann has to say about this. This is what he says. Quote, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Therefore, we have as a historical fact that people sincerely believed and were convinced that they had seen the risen Jesus." All right, so now that we've gone through those 4 facts that many scholars agree upon, the majority of them, and they've written on these subjects, we can see with any adequate historical hypothesis that these 4 facts need to be accounted for. Namely, that 1, that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion, that the early accounts of the resurrection were already circulating in the 1st century, that the tomb where Jesus was buried was found empty, and finally, that the people believed that when they saw Jesus after the tomb was found empty. So now, the question is, what is the best explanation for these 4 facts? We want to look at a theory that can match the facts that most people can agree upon, including the most skeptical scholars. We want to infer to the best explanation. Now, let's first look at some of the strongest and most famous alternative explanation for the facts. So, this is the first theory that we'll cover. Is called apparent death theory. And it says that Jesus did not die on the cross, but only appeared to die. Now, this theory says that Jesus did not really die on the cross, but merely fainted, and that after resting in the tomb for about 3 days, the cool, damp air revived him enough that he simply got up and walked out. Let's look at if the theory matches up with the minimal facts that we have. So this theory somewhat accounts for the empty tomb, the early accounts, and the post-mortem appearances. The biggest problem with this theory, of course, is that it denies Jesus died on the cross. Not only is this position repudiated by the vast majority of New Testament scholars, it's also flatly contradicted by modern science. There's the Journal of American Medical Association. They published an article titled, quote, "On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ," end quote. And this was written by William D. Edwards. And by the way, the Journal of American Medical Association is the premier publication amongst medical professionals. And so this article analyzes Jesus' flogging and crucifixion from a medical perspective, and how that, and this is what they came with the following conclusion. They said, quote, "Clearly the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, and supports the traditional view that the spear thrust between his right ribs probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium and heart, and thereby ensured his death. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge." End quote. Now, this theory has other problems as well. Even assuming Jesus survived the ordeal of being beaten, flogged, crucified for 6 hours, deprived of food and water for 3 days, if such a half-dead Jesus somehow crawled out of the tomb and made his way to the disciples, would the disciples have likely concluded that Jesus had risen from the dead in glory and triumph over the grave? I don't think so. So the apparent death theory, in conclusion, doesn't really make sense with fact number 1, the execution of Jesus on the cross. And so then we have theories like the theft theory, or that the disciples stole the body. Now, this theory was popularized in the 18th century, but really goes all the way back to the 1st century, right after Jesus' death. This theory acknowledges that Jesus died, and it fully accounts for the empty tomb. However, the theory fails to make sense of the post-mortem appearances. The early eyewitnesses were fully convinced that they had seen the risen Jesus. If the disciples stole the body, this would mean that they knew that what they were preaching was a lie. But the disciples' willingness and strong convictions to die for their beliefs in the resurrection strongly suggest that the resurrection was not something they just made up. The late Charles Colson had a unique perspective on why this theory makes no sense. Before he became a Christian, Colson was a special counsel to President Richard Nixon and was one of the dozen men involved in the Watergate scandal. And after the experience, this is what he has to say. Quote, "I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead, and then they proclaimed the truth that for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if that wasn't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible." End quote. Even if we could explain the eyewitnesses' fact away somehow, you're still left with the problem of the guard that was placed in the tomb, and one will need to explain how the disciples moved a large stone blocking the entrance without the guard noticing it or overcoming them. So therefore, stealing the body doesn't make sense with the fact that the eyewitnesses' account were there in the 1st century. The third and final theory that I want to go over is the hallucination theory. Now, this theory was popularized by David Strauss in a book in 1865, and it's held by many skeptics of the resurrection today, including people like Professor Gerd Ludemann. Now, the theory is that Jesus did indeed die, but that the disciples in their state of grief and despair were psychologically primed and made themselves believe that they had seen the risen Jesus. One major problem with this theory is, again, the empty tomb. If the disciples hallucinated and began spreading stories that they saw Jesus alive, then their opponents would have just needed to point to the dead body. And another problem is with the nature of hallucinations itself. As evidenced by psychological research, here's a quote by psychologist Gary Collins. He says, quote, "Hallucinations are individual occurrences. By their very nature, only one person can see a given hallucination at a time. They certainly aren't something which can be seen by a group of people. Neither is it possible that one person could somehow induce a hallucination in someone else. Since a hallucination exists only in this subjective personal sense, it is obvious that others cannot witness it. Also, hallucinations require a fertile mind of expectation for their circumstances hallucinated. End quote. So remember, Jesus appears alive in a dozen different instances to groups of people, to doubters and skeptics. So not only is it highly improbable that multiple people would share a hallucination of Jesus, but it's nearly impossible that people like James and Paul, who never would have expected Jesus to show up again. So that's why Gary Collins continues by stating, quote, 500 people having the same hallucination at the same time would have to be a bigger miracle than the resurrection itself, end quote. So therefore, the hallucination theory doesn't really make sense with both the eyewitness accounts of the first century and the empty tomb fact. So here we have the naturalistic explanations that fail in multiple ways, and they are largely speculative, either lacking evidential support. And so given the failure of these naturalistic theories to explain just 4 of these minimal facts of the resurrection, the best explanation given all the facts is that the resurrection of Jesus actually happened. If you remember my question from the beginning of the talk, I asked, is it plausible that Jesus rose from the dead? And I think it is. I mean, it makes sense with the fact that Jesus was executed as a criminal on the Roman crucifix and that he surely died. It makes sense with the fact that there were early accounts that the resurrection was no legend, but that people believed it almost immediately after Jesus' death. It makes sense with the fact that there was an empty tomb and that the body could not be reproduced. And finally, it makes sense with the fact that for the vast number of eyewitnesses who claimed early on that they had sincerely seen the risen Jesus. And so, Professor of Philosophy and Religion Winfried Corduan, he writes this, quote, non-miraculous explanations of what happened at the empty tomb have to face a cruel choice. Either they have to rewrite the evidence in order to suit themselves, or they have to accept the fact that they are not consistent with the present evidence. The only hypothesis that fits the evidence is that Jesus was really resurrected. End quote. The most plausible explanation that makes sense of all the facts is that the miraculous event that Jesus did rise from the dead. Now, is this explanation unreasonable? I don't see why. The point is to show which explanation fits all the facts, including even a supernatural explanation. If you're willing to admit that the supernatural exists, then the resurrection becomes the best plausible explanation of the facts. Now, the case for the miraculous is maybe another video for another time, and I won't be addressing that in this video. But what I will say is that there is a book by C.S. Lewis called Miracles, and that takes the issue straightforward on and can be a good starting point for investigating miracles. And maybe this talk has helped you to come to your own conclusion about Jesus' resurrection. And I hope it's been beneficial in seeing the plausibility in anyone's journey of faith. Or maybe you're still skeptic on the very issue. If so, let me challenge you to pursue the truth about Jesus honestly. Don't make this the only time you're willing to confront the evidence. The facts given today demand you give it some thought. Don't just tune out. See for yourself what is the best theory. And so with that, I kind of want to just invite you to continue to have an open mind, talk to different people, and ask them, how did they come to understand the Bible, God, and life? Below, I've linked a few resources that really aided me in my study of the material. And I'm also putting down my email. So if anyone would like to send me questions on the topic, we would love to hear from you. So, in conclusion, it is this truth that Jesus resurrected that not only changed the very course of human history, but also changed my life forever. And I hope that it can actually change yours as well. So, thank you.